Good afternoon. My name is Melinda Haring. I'm the editor of the UkraineAlert blog at the Atlantic Council in Washington, and I'm delighted to be here for a panel on digital media. We're joined with 4 phenomenal experts from the think tank community, from a parliament, from the university, and from a technology company. So before I begin, I want to just plug the Atlantic Council for 1 minute. We've been studying disinformation for a long time, and we have a fantastic website, and it's called the Disinfo Portal. It's disinfoportal.com, and I encourage everyone to take a look at it. We've aggregated sort of the best information. Many of my folks here have contributed to it as well. So without further ado, I'd like to introduce my panel. On the end is Dmitri Teperik from the International Center for Defense and Security in Estonia. Next to him is Marietje Schaake, a former deputy of the European Parliament until recently from the Netherlands. Next over is Jan Neutze with Microsoft in the United States. And then finally to my right is Yevhen Fedchenko, the director of the Mohyla School of Journalism and the co-founder of StopFake. Now, we will end in an hour, and everyone here has homework. You need to put your phones down because I'm going to ask you to jump in and ask questions. We're going to use our time to have a discussion, but we also want you to join us. So I'm going to turn to Dmitri first. Dmitri, which of the new emerging threats in the propaganda and disinformation space should we be worried about? There's a lot of new terminology, and many of us here aren't experts. So I've come across terms like deep fakes, computational propaganda, and also domestic audiences are amplifying pro-Kremlin disinformation campaigns. Could you start by telling us what these terms mean and then telling us what you're worried about?
Well, thank you. What I'm worrying about actually is disinformation more and more penetrating entertainment sphere. It's not only about, let's say, so-called fake news. It's not in a news program or kind of debate show that we consume mis or disinformation from. It's more and more embedded in entertainment, in series, I don't know, on Netflix or Amazon, in different, state-supported movies, but also in computer games aimed at young people. Say that, of course, I do realize that such things like deepfakes and computational propaganda and coordinated information campaigns on social media are as well kind of information threats. But I think we are kind of learning more and more how to react on these. But I think we have no clue how to unlearn from disinformation or misinformation received from entertainment. That's something we should focus on, I think.
Interesting. I haven't heard anyone flag that yet. Do you have any specific examples of shows that you would point to?
Well, I would give you an example about my country. And, well, from 2014, when Russia basically attacked Ukraine and Crimea was occupied, and Russia started the war in eastern Ukraine, everywhere was kind of expected and popular question, who will be next? And will be Estonia next, or the Baltic states will be next? And now basically, and that was of course kind of expected and a deliberate question on that issue. And after that, we saw the very same narrative already used in different movies. Recently, actually, Netflix devoted a whole season on the Berlin station, actually devoted to hybrid war in Estonia. So now, I mean, that kind of harmful narrative is already embedded in entertainment. And, well, despite of the resources, I mean, all strategic communication efforts of the talks of our politicians and experts, the Western public is already kind of intoxicated with this question, will be Estonia next attacked by Russia? That's just an example. And so you can imagine how many narratives produced by pro-Kremlin creators of different series and movies are spread, let's say, here in Ukraine. And this is basically so the way how they reach the public is entertainment. Well, not just movies and series, it's also, you know, kind of comedy shows and everything which makes you laugh, which makes you feel comfortable, which makes you feel a little bit detached from the reality, makes you feel entertained. And embedding that kind of disinformation or manipulations into entertainment is something which worries me very much.
Thank you. We heard this morning on the first panel about the need for government, technology, and the media to get involved to start solving this problem of disinformation, fake news. And I'd like to ask Jan, who's at Microsoft now, can you tell us, I know Microsoft has been really active at working with civil society and alerting them to potential hacks. What potential cyber offense measures can be taken by democracies to stop these malign information operations?
Great, thanks very much. And just want to say thank you to Aspen Kiev for inviting us. It's a pleasure to be back in Ukraine. Let me maybe just start out by just sharing a few observations more generally before coming to your question. I think broadly speaking, what we're seeing around the world is that the 75 democracies that exist in the world are under threat, and they're under threat in multiple ways. Technology is playing a critical role in that context, and we believe technology can be used both, of course, as a tool, but also as a weapon in that context. And that's pretty much exactly what we've been seeing for the last few years, not just in the disinformation context, but when we think more broadly around some of the other threats to democratic processes, democratic institutions. That includes cyber attacks on prominent politicians, on campaigns, as well as the electoral infrastructure itself. The picture that presents itself really is one of sort of a hybrid threat environment. In that context, and to help address some of these threats, we think that technology companies obviously have a special responsibility to help. And while no one company can help solve these challenges and no one government can, we all need to come together in new ways to try and address this. And as part of that, what we did at Microsoft a year and a half ago is we launched a new program that we're calling our Defending Democracy program, which is trying to focus really on these hybrid threats. And it has three key components. One is to boost and bolster disinformation defense. But two is also trying to focus on specifically protecting political parties and other political stakeholders through cybersecurity measures and applying the security tools and techniques that we typically would offer and implement for global enterprises specifically to these stakeholders. And then three is to focus specifically on the electoral threat itself. And to come back to your question, on the disinformation side of things, in my view at least, I think it's sort of two things that we need to really try to focus our attention on. One is to actually boost societal resilience to these challenges. There is a lot that can be done through media literacy efforts, as a few folks mentioned this in the earlier panel, that can really try to actually help distinguish citizens, users across, especially in democracies, across societies, to try and distinguish what is fake from what is real, and to develop critical thinking skills to actually be in a position that makes folks just much more resilient from a societal level. We're doing a lot of work in that space, mostly through partnerships with others, as well as some of the things we're doing directly. I just turned this off. There is a really interesting effort by a company called NewsGuard. NewsGuard is an effort that essentially tries to provide ratings for news websites. They're not blocking content, but what they're trying to do is give more context and more information to users by rating these news websites and essentially based on 9 journalistic ethics principles, develop either a red or a green rating. It's pretty simple. And then whenever anybody navigates to news articles through search engines or sort of any other portal, provided you have this NewsGuard feature enabled, you actually get to a place that shows you sort of the integrity and the trustworthiness of this particular news website. That's one effort that we think is worth supporting. There are several other similar efforts, but the challenge is these solutions exist, but they haven't yet reached, I think, the scale that's needed to actually really implement those efforts broadly.
Thanks a lot, Jan. Let me ask you a follow-up question. On that NewsGuard, is that something that people would have to voluntarily participate in, or is that something that tech companies would just put in the software or put on new computers?
Yeah, it's a good question. So in the case of our partnership with NewsGuard, what we help do is support the development of a very simple one-click browser plugin. And these browser plugins work across the board for all standard browsers, not just ours. And it's very much based on an opt-in principle. So this is not being forced on anybody, but people can opt in. What NewsGuard has also done is to partner with universities and library systems across different countries. And they're now present, I think, they've rated news websites about 98% of all English-speaking news websites. They've done this in France, in Germany, in Georgia, and they're looking to actually expand further. And so again, this is an effort. While it's not a Microsoft offering, it's something we support because we believe in the utility of driving this sort of media literacy and broadly speaking disinformation defense work.
Great, thanks a lot. Marietje, I'm interested in what the EU has been up to. I was reading about some of the actions you took last year. So there was a voluntary code of practice that asked social media companies and other platforms to be more transparent with their algorithms and their advertising campaigns, to flag fake news and close accounts which promote them. Can you tell us a little bit more about that code? And I guess let's cut to the chase. Is the code working? Does it make sense to punish social media companies as a follow-up?
So good afternoon, everybody. I'm really happy to be here in Ukraine. I want to thank the organizers and everybody for participating in what I think is an extremely important discussion, the relation between democracy and technology. And so first off, and I think it may sound obvious to some people, but in the debate about the role of government and regulation and technology, it's not, and I think that's worrying. I think it is absolutely legitimate for democratic governments to make sure that principles, the rule of law, are safeguarded, and that technology companies, just like every other company, have to abide by those rules. And we have to distinguish more in the debate about multi-stakeholder engagement and the role of government between democratic governments and non-democratic governments. And what we see in practice is that they're often swept together, and this is really to the detriment of democracy and the legitimacy of democratic governments itself. So starting there, I think that the European Commission was legitimate and had a very good goal in mind by developing the code of practice. And I also believe that one of the reasons why they started with voluntary measures on the part of social media platforms and tech companies was because there has been systematic pushback against any regulatory effort to rein in these tech companies throughout the past decade that I've seen myself. There was constant arguing that any regulation would stifle innovation, that any action from the European side might inspire China. Well, I really wish we did. Because we see that authoritarian regimes like the Chinese are actually doing what they wish, to instrumentalize technology to control their people. So as a reaction to the many, many incidents that we now know of disinformation, of botnets, of conspiracy theories, rankings, algorithms really optimized for profit, optimized for keeping people online as long as possible to sell as many as possible ads, and the big, big impact that has had on democracy, not only in terms of sharing stories that are not true, like let's say the elections are on October 10th, the story would suggest that they would be on October 12th. This is evidently untrue. But I believe that the real agenda of those people who are deploying any kinds of methods, technological or offline, to undermine liberal democracy is to decrease participation, to make people wonder whether there is such a thing as truth at all, to erode trust, and to really start to unravel the very, very carefully built and crafted democratic institutions that safeguard our people's quality of life. And we cannot allow that to happen. Now, is the code of practice an answer? Is it the shield that Europe has been waiting for? Is it the set of measures that will protect people's democratic rights? No, it is not. It is an effort that I think has brought fruitful lessons, but it has done a few things that I think are fundamentally wrong from an approach point of view, which is, one, outsourced the responsibility for making available information, for example, about political advertisements in a database, giving that responsibility back to the very companies that, in my opinion, are too powerful as they are. Think about Google, Facebook as examples, but there are other companies. Second problem is that this is a voluntary code. So there are companies that have decided to sign up, to engage, to participate, but it's not binding. There are also other companies that have an influence in this space that are not part of the code, not willing to engage at all. And then a number of expected steps from the companies involved are very vague, like to take reasonable measures. Well, I don't know if you've ever had the pleasure of engaging with representatives of companies, but normally speaking, if you are doing a lot of things, you probably think that you're doing a reasonable effort. But I may actually disagree with whether that's enough and whether that reasonable effort was solid enough. So I think we have to draw the conclusion that more is needed to make sure that there is transparency about the practices of these companies. Because frankly speaking, we don't even know what the best approach should be in the interest of safeguarding people's democratic rights if we don't know how the business models and the algorithms of these companies exactly work. And that's how we end up in a sort of chicken or an egg kind of discussion with these companies who tell us, like Facebook, for example, please regulate us. But how is a regulator, a lawmaker, supposed to make a well-informed proposal on how to regulate if he or she does not know what is going on in the machine rooms of these companies? So we have a problem when it comes to the lack of transparency and, as a result, the lack of oversight and accountability. And these are essentially core principles that are needed as such to safeguard democracy, and that may also need specific measures to avoid disinformation and attacks on our liberal democracy, which are continuing to happen. And so until we've done everything that we can to prevent these attacks, which I don't think will stop, this is an ongoing challenge that we will face. We faced historically, there are now new methods, but the fact that there are people who want to undermine our liberal democracy is not new. So we have to step up our efforts and make sure that technology company or otherwise, that there is accountability.
Great, thank you so much. So even the EU is struggling with this, Yevhen. This is a big challenge. A country like Ukraine, though, has even more limited resources and is being attacked a lot by Russia. It can't take on all digital challenges. If you have to prioritize, what solutions would you propose?
Yeah, first of all, thank you so much for inviting me. And also I want to use this opportunity to shamelessly plug in StopFake. Over here, if you are not still following us, please do it right now. So we are very easy to find on Twitter. It's Stop Faking News. It's like an appeal to all of you. Stop faking news, stop participating in this. And this is the only excuse why you can be now in your phones. And answering your question, really it's a huge challenge. And actually StopFake spends the last 5 years looking into all those challenges which Ukraine has, and definitely for us disinformation is one of the priorities. And we so far accumulated a huge experience. And this is a story when Ukraine not only can be a recipient of the knowledge, but when Ukraine can be the entity which sharing the huge experience how to tackle back disinformation. And it was important from a data collection also point of view, because we collected so far more than 3,000 fake stories. And again, this is only just a tip of the iceberg. And actually, as it was said today, fake news is only the part of bigger disinformation. So we really don't need to give up. We don't need to relax, because this is a war. So basically what we can prove with the data we already collected, we are dealing with a war. The second finding is we are dealing with a global war. So Ukraine is not the only place where it's happening. It's happening on the global scale. And third important moment we should understand, it's dynamic war. So we cannot say, okay, we tackled some portion of fake news and we have meta-narratives kind of fixed, so now we can stop doing that. So that's why we continue debunking, because with meta-narratives, it's very important to understand that if you don't feed into that, if you create a vacuum of information, someone else would come over there and would bring other meta-narratives probably you don't want to have around. And I would give you just one example, which is not Ukrainian, but probably more global. So today is the anniversary of 9/11. And for many, many years, we already know who the perpetrators were and how it happened and what actually happened. But if you would go to all those fringe websites and social media, you would still notice that thousands or even millions of people in different parts of the world are still discussing conspiracy theories, and they find credibility to them. And I mean, we have almost 18 years since 9/11, but people are still sticking to the meta-narratives they want to promote because there is some reason for that. And that's exactly what is happening in this global information warfare. Those who push meta-narratives with a more push, they would be winning, and you need to basically resist and deter them all the time. Another important thing is that this is participatory war. So we don't have some actors who are in and some actors who are out. Basically, you cannot opt out these days not to be a part of this war. Everybody participates in this. The difference is only in what capacity you do that. Are you object or are you subject to that war? Are you pushing your meta-narratives or someone is pushing their meta-narratives on you? So this is important finding. And all that basically is challenges we need to respond. And the problem is there is no just one answer. And again, as I said, we've been around for 5 years already. And to some extent, basically, we've seen some kind of understanding of the problem at the global scale, and there is some awareness, but every time when my colleagues and mine are going to any audience, we still find people who deny the existence of information warfare, provide the disbeliefs, and find some reasons not to respond to that. And this is absolutely kind of wrong tactics, because if we would not be respond, and when I'm saying we, I mean the civil society, journalists, tech companies, government. So you cannot fight this problem only from one side, because it's a universal problem, and you can respond only collectively to that. And for this, you need to have data. For this, you need to have research. And the last but not least, you need to know how to translate collected data and research into policy making, because if it does not go into the policy making, it's basically all in vain, because even if we know everything about information warfare and we do nothing about that, we'll lose it.
So you mentioned debunking, and I'd like to ask you, there's a debate within this community about debunking. Does it work? What evidence would you cite that it actually works? And there's another panelist who disagrees with you, so I'd like to hear your arguments. Make a case for it, please.
Yeah, so of course, as a representative from StopFake, I should stick to the point that it works, but not only for the kind of corporate reason, but also for the reason that we really believe in what we are doing, and we really believe in the necessity of this. And if we go back to 2014, at that point there was an absolute vacuum of information in Ukraine. And if StopFake and other representatives of civil society would not step in and try to fill this void, we definitely would have much worse situation. So we conducted research 2 years ago asking Ukrainians, it was a poll across Ukraine, do they recognize the existence of Russian disinformation as a major threat to Ukrainian media environment? And 58% of people said yes, and I'm very happy with that. So it's still very far from being 100%, but it's 58% more than we used to have 5 years ago. This is very, very good reason for us to stay around. The second reason why it was important to debunk, because with that we created difference. So if people would start searching now information on Russian-Ukraine war, they would not only find what Russian disinformation want you to believe in, they would also find what StopFake is, and many other organizations are debunking and providing the alternative, and probably that would give the reason to some people to stop and think why there are different point of view about the same event. Probably this is not what Russians want us to believe. Another reason is archiving. So as I already mentioned, we have now a huge archive of disinformation. And again, it proves the existence of disinformation as organized, state-run, state-sponsored and state-organized campaign. Without the data, again, I coming from academia, in order to prove something, we need to have data. We need to be on the kind of evidential basis. So now we have all those evidences that, yes, there is this campaign, and this campaign is organized by the government of Russia. And this is also very important. So basically, we came up with an acronym which is MAD. So we are saying we are mad about Russian disinformation. So first is monitoring, archiving, and debunking, because that really pays off. And the very last reason why we need to do that is media literacy, which was already mentioned here. So with those debunked stories, we actually help people to visualize what is the real news and how some state or non-state actors want to portray non-news as news, and basically fake the whole media environment. And I really do believe in our mission, because I do believe that it will help to save democracy at some point.
Perfect, thank you. Dmitri, you've criticized debunking fake news as too late and ineffective. Help us understand your argument and respond to Yevhen. If you don't if you don't bother to respond to the fake information and it spreads, doesn't that incentivize bad actors to keep at it and perhaps even do more? And what's the alternative to debunking?
Yeah, thank you. Well, unfortunately, bad actors basically don't care about what they think. And saying that, of course, I do appreciate the work Yevhen and his team are doing, really. And I do see the reason in debunking for, let's say, collecting a comprehensive database of evidence about information crimes of the Russian Federation. Absolutely. We do need that. Well, the question is, what to do next? Are we going to have kind of information Nuremberg tribunal on Russia, based on debunked lies and myth? So basically, so my problem is I'm struggling with follow-up actions which could use the work or the results of the work done by Yevhen and other teams in other countries. Well, naturally, debunking is, of course, always late, because we cannot predict the future lies. Well, the problem with debunking is with this information that well, carefully designed information campaigns follow two basic rules. First of all is manipulations, how to manipulate human behavior in order to make them do something or not to do something. And the second one is diversion. Diversion of our attention, diversion of our resources. And psychologically, human beings, I mean, we just reacted as Russia expected us to react. They produced, let's say, thousands of lies, and then, of course, we expected to tell the truth. Of course, no, the truth is. So our response to the lies was already predicted by them, that we are going into a race of debunking, and every country and not every, but let's say many NGOs will do that. And this is diversion of our attention and our resources, because a lot of disinformation happens or is being spread not just through, let's say, classical media or through media channels or through news, but it's also entertainment. And we are not how we're going to debunk a comedy show or some TV series or other entertainment programs. It's social media, and also, as actually Ukrainian experience showed clearly, that many lies and semi-truths and manipulations were and still are spread by citizens from mouth to mouth. It's basically rumors and gossips. especially on local and regional level, and you are not going to debunk that anyway. So, I mean, I'm not telling that debunking is a bad thing, not absolutely not. It's very needed, but it's not a silver bullet. It's a good thing, but it's just one of, let's say, many possible reactions to the disinformation. Thank you.
Okay, great, thank you. Jan, let's talk about who's responsible for all of the fake news and the content we're worried about. We know from a study that was recently put out that Russia's the most successful actor in spreading propaganda and fake news by a factor of 3. But who else should we be worried about, and how similar and different are their tactics from the Russians?
Yeah, I think it's a really important question. And as we're having this debate, I also think it's important that we're trying to ground ourselves in data as much as possible. And the study you mentioned, I want to pick up on that. It's actually one of the other efforts that we have supported from our Defending Democracy program. And this is work done by some researchers at Princeton University that put out a report really just a couple of months ago, and I'd encourage you all to go and take a look at it. They essentially worked for the last year, 18 months or so, to track foreign influence efforts from 2013 to 2018. And in the course of those 5 years, they ended up tracking about 53 distinct influence efforts by nation states. 2/3 of those, according to their research, were indeed driven by Russia, as you mentioned. But I think some of the interesting parts of the study really reflect the fact that the problem is global in many dimensions. It's global in that it's not only Russia. There are a handful of other nation states that are operating off of a similar playbook. The study specifically mentions Iran, China, as well as Saudi Arabia. Again, this is their research. But it also reflects that victim states are spread across the 75 democracies that we've been talking about. And in this case, they were able to track impact in 24 distinct countries. And so when you think about the scale and scope, it's really not only about one actor. It is predominantly about one actor, but it is broader. It is not about 1 or 2 countries in the West that are being affected by this. It is a much broader footprint. And then they have some additional interesting data in terms of some of the I'm not sure I get this right. Some of the tactics that they have been using. And so, we've been talking quite a bit about these disinformation campaigns being used to spread dissent or trying to get different sides of a society kind of become more polarized as a key goal. That certainly happens. According to their research, they only ascribed about 15% of what they've been seeing in terms of this activity to that type of an outcome. So trying to foster a dissent on both sides or polarization of society on 2 sides of an argument accounted for about 15%. What they saw much more often, in fact, was the targeting of specific individuals, usually politicians, or trying to sway opinion in favor of a particular policy outcome. And they mentioned the independence vote in Spain in 2017 as something of particular example where the online campaign was very much trying to focus and favor the yes campaign. And so it is important, I think, that study is probably the most comprehensive effort to date to track foreign influence operations. And it's informed a lot of other research and other policy work, including in the U.S. Congress. And so it is critical that we try to ground ourselves in that data and facts as much as we can.
Jan, let me ask you a follow-up question about the study. Did you find any evidence, or did the researchers find any evidence that these other bad actors are studying Russian tactics and copying them?
I think it is an important question. I'm not sure the study goes into a whole lot of detail there, but some of the things that I can just say from a Microsoft perspective is when we compare what we're seeing in the disinformation space to some of the things we're seeing in the cyber space, which is sort of closely related, because oftentimes, of course, as I mentioned earlier, these operations are more hybrid, where we see hacking attempts then coupled with sort of broader disinformation efforts. There very clearly is, I'd say there's some best practices that best actors use that they do emulate. And so what you see one nation state successfully implement, sometimes at least you see others use. When it comes to the technical specifics, of course, people tend to use and different actors tend to use different tools and techniques in terms of trying to compromise accounts and different types of malware being used. But I think the meta point here is it is a challenge that we need to try and counter in a much broader, sustained effort, given that there are adversary groups out there that extend much beyond one particular actor.
I think Yevhen's right. We all got to get in the game. You can't sit on the sideline. You can't avoid this. Marietje, I'd like to ask you another question. So East Stratcom has been monitoring disinformation cases from Russia, and they were monitoring the cases in 2018 and then also this year in 2019, right around the European parliamentary elections in May. And they found that there were twice as many disinformation cases as this year than the previous years. So one could argue that this shows that our current approach in Europe, which is documenting disinformation and raising awareness about these cases, isn't working. Bad actors will find new ways and new strategies. Here's my question. When will the EU start implementing measures, or is there any reason to think that the new parliament is going to begin implementing some new measures that would stop Russia and other hostile actors from conducting these kinds of information campaigns? And what should these measures look like? I know you're no longer a European Parliament, so you can speak freely now.
Oh, I've always spoken freely. It's one of the great things about having freedom of expression, and I think that that's what makes this tricky as well, because there are a lot of things that are, you know, maybe crazy, maybe conspiracies, but it's not illegal to say the earth is flat. It's not illegal to say that vaccinations against child diseases are harmful for your child. I mean, it's not true. It's scientifically not proven. You're harming your child, but it's not illegal at this point. And I think the example about the outbreaks of measles are very interesting in the sense that it shows that you may only need to persuade a small group of people to have a massive impact, and that a few people can have a massive impact on the public interest. And I think that that's also important to keep in mind when we think about undermining of trust in liberal democracy, which I deliberately describe much more broadly than just focusing on disinformation, because I think disinformation is one part, but it can, I think, you know, unjustly suggest that there is a truth that everybody agrees on, and that there is an alternative to that that many people can disagree with, and that if we can just figure that out, that that's the end of the story, and it's not. And similarly, what we're seeing is it's not just about information, it's about who gets presented this information. It's about data collection on very, 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 very specific categories of people, on the basis of their searches in search engines, on the basis of other trackers, and if you can reach just the right people, you can sway elections, you can persuade journalists, you can really make the decisive difference without having to win, let's say, the argument about what is the absolute truth and what is not. And what we've been seeing, and you know, I've seen the same report about the role of Russia in disinformation, but I think if you look at the debate about disinformation, there's been a lot of attention on the role of Russia, and there's not as much attention on, for example, domestic actors playing an increasing role in this. There's not as much attention on people who are spreading certain information for very, very cynical but commercial purposes. You know, people may have blogs that they want to sell ads against, for example, about vaccinations, but maybe also about 9/11 or, you know, MH17, a very important topic in Dutch society, where, you know, I already have people in my personal circles, highly educated, well informed, who conclude that we will probably never know the truth about MH17. Okay, it's a popularly held conclusion that people have simply lost the trust, and this is in one of the most sort of high trust societies, the Netherlands, where we have a lot of media pluralism. People were ranking the quality of their lives this week in a poll, saying that they graded their lives with 7.8 out of 10, and still with trust in democracy, trust and diverse media sources, people really are are saying we may never find the truth. And I think that that may actually be the goal of those people who are undermining our democracy, to make people turn away from the idea that there can ever be institutions that can be trusted, and that might also give them a sense of diminishing agency on their own part. And when people turn away from participating or from seeking accountability, for example, in the case of MH17, or when people turn away from politics because they think similarly that it doesn't really matter, you know, my vote doesn't really matter, it's all the same, what's happening on the part of political parties and leaders, then we have a real problem, because participation in a liberal democracy is vital for its survival. And so the reason why I wanted to share all this is because I don't think we are covering the entire challenge by simply looking at what alternative narratives about big events are coming from the Russian side, but that this is a more dynamic challenge that is also changing shape gradually, and that we have to deal with in more multifaceted ways. And then last thing I wanted to also share, which I think is a specific phenomenon of the online world, because you were talking about entertainment and sort of a place for narratives. I'm also quite worried about the notion that young people find information about politics, society, online mostly. But online there's also massive entertainment and frankly sort of dumbing down of people's interest in things. I mean, when I see that I think it's, what's her name, Kylie Kardashian, she has 150 million followers on Instagram. You know, this is a massive seeping of attention of young people, and this is just one example. We could also talk about sports, fashion, gossip, other things like that, quizzes. I think we have to also learn more about what the impact is of sort of the entertainification, if that's a word, of everything, at the expense of having some kind of pluralist media landscape, some kind of moment where a significant proportion of the population is exposed to matters that are of impact for society, like news.
Or perhaps we need to consider other methods of storytelling, right? If audiences want to be entertained and they want jokes, perhaps we need to tell the news in a more interesting way.
Well, I'm a liberal, so this may sound very counterintuitive, but I don't think that we should just go with what people want. I hear this argument all the time. When I talk to people in the United States, they say, oh, you know, my 16-year-old child doesn't care about privacy anymore. Privacy is actually dead for the next generation. Well, that's interesting, because in Europe, the right to privacy is a right that governments ought to protect. So you cannot just say, oh, our people don't want it anymore. And normally when, you know, our people say we really don't want to pay taxes, or we want to drink 5 liters of vodka every day, there are some limitations to the freedom of choice in the general interest. Now, of course, when it comes to what people want to consume in terms of information, it's very hard to draw lines. But here again, I come back to the point I made earlier. If we don't even know what's going on online, because we have no shared experiences anymore. Everybody has their own experience, we don't know how the algorithms work, then it's hard to know what the problem is and what the solution might be. So the step between doing something or, you know, presenting the news, and I think actually media companies are trying, at least in our country, news companies are trying to present news in different ways, using Instagram, using Facebook, using Twitter, using a lot more video than text than they did in the past, trying to offer the news in different ways, but it's hard to know whether it can compete with much more sort of flashy, instant gratification, adrenaline pumping kind of posts that in turn will make those posts rank higher on YouTube, higher on Google, higher on your Facebook timeline, and higher on your Twitter timeline.
I know that all too well. I'm an editor, and we spend far too much time thinking about clickbait titles, right? Your boss wants views, so it's a huge problem, absolutely. Yevhen wanted to jump in, please.
Yeah, I actually want to add something from a perspective of media industry, because media industry is often to be blamed for the tendencies we have right now, but actually, again, we should understand that it's kind of a two-way highway. So media industry is always looking what audiences want, and audiences always consume what media industry is offering to them. And so we should understand that aspect. And another aspect is that it becomes more and more difficult to bring facts to people, because people are not interested in facts. They're actually interested in entertainment, which should be easy, which does not make them thinking very much. As a friend of mine, Peter Pomerantsev, said, people hate facts because, and they hate truth, because the truth is, for example, all of us are going to die. Would you love that statement? You know, of course, no. And all other things are very, very difficult to perceive and to live with that. And that's why we basically see people moving more and more to the lighter forms. They are not interested in politics as that anymore. And we often see how basically media industry is using that privilege and try to push lighter and lighter type of contents on the audiences, explaining that that's exactly what they want. But here again, we have this catch-22. When I was a journalist, we had difficulties, for example, with doing more international news to Ukrainian audience, because editors were saying, they're not interested in that. But my point was, but they do not get them, how they might know if they're interested in that or no, and said, yeah, well, but we know better that they're not interested in news about Africa or Middle East or whatever. And again, that's kind of vicious circle we need to stop somewhere. And another aspect is that, and it's again connected to disinformation, because the main point of disinformation is to sow confusion among audiences, and that's exactly what you mentioned with MH17. If people have been receiving hundreds and hundreds contradictory explanations what happened to MH17, at some point they would be tired of that and would say, okay, stop, I'm not interested in that anymore, because we would never know the real truth, it's somewhere there. This is actually the main objective of disinformation, to make people stop being interested in actual news, and at the second stage to be stopped being interested and participate in politics. So politics become kind of a one way when politicians are doing some things, and then we have audiences absolutely disengaged from the process for one very simple reason, because they've been explained that it's not up to them, or we would decide for you everything. And also, as we've seen, for example, in Ukrainian case, that, and not only in Ukraine, that politicians are often saying to media, we don't need you anymore as a mediator in this process. We can now directly communicate to the audiences through social media, through multiple channels we have. And so there is a big question, what would be the role for media in this process? Would we survive in that? Would we stay relevant? This is a huge question. We don't know the answer to this. And also we should understand, again, I already mentioned meta-narratives, and we should understand how difficult it is to build them up. So, for example, in Ukrainian case, we spend, when I'm saying we, I mean in civil society, but also Ukrainian diplomats and many others, and journalists, explaining, for example, that we have Russia's war against Ukraine. It's not a civil war, it's not other things. And that the key to this very problem is in Russia, and you really need to talk to Russia, and it was a basis on kind of international coalition and sanctions and all other things. And then the last week we have event, the swap of prisoners of war, and it immediately completely changed the way the conversation is built, because international media immediately came to the conclusion that in Ukraine it's really the civil war, even though Russia somehow returns prisoners of war, and that now Russia demonstrates more and more evidences of going to normalcy, to peace, and all other things. And there is no more war. And that was made just in a couple of days period of time. So basically the meta-narrative, which was built during 5 last years, was killed with an event which was very humanitarian, which was very needed, which all of us expected, and we greeted back the prisoners of war, but we should understand how the mechanics of the meta-narratives work and how it's very easy to change the conversation and basically to change the basic premises of international politics just with one click.
I think it's a little bit more complicated than that, right? I take your point, but the international audience isn't paying attention to the details of Ukraine, right? They don't know everything that's been happening here. They only read the headlines, and Ukraine is not in the international news anymore. Ukraine is lucky to get in the international news once a month, frankly, and it's just not there. So it's really hard to get accurate information about Ukraine, and people want peace, right? This has been, we're now into the 5.5, 6 years. So people are looking for, any hope that the situation might be changing for the better. So I think you're right, but there's some other pieces that need to be identified as well.
Yeah, but actually there is a short answer to this because due to, again, to proliferation of digital media and due to the tendencies now, it's not important what is actually happening, but it's important how you've been explained what is happening and by whom. So if you would have more and more people repeating the same scenes and dominating again in the conversation, if they would be calling it in one way, more and more people would perceive this as the reality. So that's a lack of critical thinking, the intensity of communication and intensity of politics in general. Yeah. So people just don't have enough time to get in depth into the issues. And you're right, Ukraine dropped from radar because people cannot stick with their attention and their span is really very, very low. And Ukraine's problem is someone else's problem, actually.
And there's a lot of other things going on in the world, competing, right? Now, I'd like to bring you into the conversation. We have about 10 minutes. If you would like to ask a question, please raise your hand, and someone will bring you a microphone. Is anyone brave? Okay, this gentleman here, please. And if you could say your name and identify yourself and ask a question, and a question has a question mark, so please don't make a long statement. Thanks.
Tyson Barker from Aspen, Germany. My question is, it's just something that I'm intuiting a little bit, and I don't have any facts to back this up, but I'd like to ask all the panelists about the role of disinformation launderers. So we talk a lot about technological intermediaries, what's the responsibility of platforms, but what is the responsibility of individuals, influencers, who move information, and I think about it, because I'm an American, so I think about the US context, from RT to Fox News. There's a pivot point where it goes up. How much are we identifying these people, localizing these people, and what can be done to address this issue?
Thanks.
Thank you so much. It's a great question, actually, because RT and Sputnik and all other outlets which are a part of the disinformation ecosystem, as we call it, they really rely on influencers because that make looking them legit, that give more weight to what they are doing, and that basically legitimize them as real media. And that was exactly what the coalition we are participating in, it's kind of informal coalition of fact-checking organizations. We've always been trying to talk out to policymakers and other influencers that you really don't need to participate in this. You just give credibility to this. And it's the first, and the second thing is basically you never know what they're going to do with the content you provide them. So they can very easily manipulate your absolutely right words, good ideas into the framework of what they really want to get out of that. And we also been trying to do the kind of naming and shaming campaign also for so-called journalists who are integral part of this ecosystem, and saying that RT is not media organization, which means those people who work for RT are not real journalists, so they should not be given the privileges which journalists usually enjoy, like access to information and right for interviews and other things. But unfortunately, this idea was not very widely supported because the bottom line was like our audiences are smart and we should not decide for them what is good and what is bad. The problem is probably yes, the audiences are smart sometimes, But again, as I said, they are not paying attention to what we are paying because we are immersed in this environment for 24 hours a day and we see all the details of what's going on. The normal person usually immersed into their Facebook feed and consume information very, very quickly, running somewhere, you know, sharing even without opening the item and doing many other things. So I would not call that smart consumption. And so definitely that means we should not delegate much now to the audiences, but the responsibility is with them as well, because again, that's about their critical consumption. We can give them some ideas, but then it's up to them what they do with those ideas. We, again, for example, we can support the decision of Ukrainian court to limit Russian TV channels over here, but as we know, many people are still watching Russian media through satellite dishes, for example, which means they invest in their own money and they are ready to run the extra mile just to get permanent access to disinformation machine, you know, and it's their choice. Neither we nor government can limit that. So we say, yeah, we're identifying it as a malign sources of information, but that, again, what they're doing with that information, that's up to them. So it's very complex and there are many participants in this process, but definitely, as I said, we should call the things as they are. We should call spade a spade, you know, and there is no still consensus on this, but even though situation improved, because I remember 5 years ago there were a lot of moments when I was sitting on the same panel with people from RT, which is not happening anymore, so at least it's a small achievement over here. There is some understanding, but on another hand, what disinformation ecosystem is doing, they really try to hide now their belonging to this, so they create some organizations which you would not say immediately they belong to this disinformation ecosystem, like Raptly, which is subsidiary of RT. They are based in Berlin. They are calling themselves like Reuters. They are offering a lot of free stuff to media outlets across Europe. And if you would go to Google search, you would see their stories coming up at the very first search matches, you know, and other things, or Redfish, or Happening Now, or many other outlets which are doing the disinformation work, but without much kind of identifying themselves as being disinformation outlets. So we also need to follow that and to identify to people that, yeah, if you want to go on watching this or consuming this, it's your right. But for example, we're also using one of startups which is using our database, StopFake database, and it's a Chrome plugin, and it also can be used for Facebook. So if the person goes to one of the websites which was identified by us as a source for fake news, that would immediately identify to the person that you are now consuming information from the source of fake news, as it was identified by the live fact checker from StopFake.org.
Gotcha, thank you. We have time for one more question. The gentleman in the middle, please.
Thank you for interesting discussion. Now, humans are complicated. Vyacheslav Bihun, I'm a filmmaker and legal scholar. People are complicated creatures, and in order to identify them, we understand that they are driven by needs. How digital media will transform the structure of needs of people? Will we be still free human beings, or will be a part of a matrix that we don't control? Thank you.
Thank you, that's a great question. Would you like that?
I'm going to have Jan talk about it as well. But recently somebody asked to a group of people, how many of you believe that your phone is actually listening to you because it comes up with suggestions of the things you were actually looking for, chatting with your friends? I don't know, how many of you feel that way? And then the question is, you know, do the algorithms know you so well that they already know where your next thought is going to be, or is it actually, you know, like what's the chicken or the egg, who's following who, essentially, right? Because with so much data being collected by the apps that you install, even if you're not using that app, for example, you know, they could still track what other sites you're visiting. And so I think indeed the question of what is still free choice, but also what is the role of political leaders now that they can poll to great detail, now that they can anticipate where success is going to lie, you know, how much of an incentive will there be for leaders to, for example, I mean, I won't give the example to sell the story that we're all going to die, even though it's, in my opinion, true. But other, perhaps unpopular messages which sometimes have to be sold because, you know, difficult government reforms have to happen, difficult measures, for example, to protect the environment for the next generation have to happen, security measures may have to happen, et cetera, et cetera. So the question of the liberal democracy, where choice comes from and to what extent it's steered and what kind of incentives it creates for leaders to mostly follow instead of pave the way, I think is a more philosophical question that we definitely have to deal with and that we will have better answers to in terms of what the state of influence already is through the increased use of technology if we knew more about what the technologies were actually doing. Because I think another incentive for politicians is to always pretend that they know everything. But the brutal reality is there is so much we don't know that nobody knows. Perhaps the people in the companies don't even know anymore because the businesses themselves, the algorithms themselves, you know, the whole fine-tuning, increasingly so through machine learning. I've talked to computer engineers or coders who basically told me that they themselves don't know where, let's say, the head and the tail of a certain program and business model really is anymore. So all of that is to say that in order to understand exactly what might be the limits to the actual free choice of an individual as a result of the use of technology really leads us back to the question that we began with, which is we can only address it if we have oversight and transparency.
I'll just add to that. I thought, you know, I would agree with Marietje on those points. I'll maybe add a couple of things briefly. One, you know, from a Microsoft perspective, we don't operate a general purpose social media network, and so it's tough for me to talk about the specifics there. That said, we're a large global technology actor, and I think we consistently find ourselves in discussions with our colleagues in the tech industry to try and convince them to actually, along with us and others, step up and really do more across the board. And transparency is a fundamental value, I think, in this regard. And I'll sort of talk about a couple things with regards to regulation. I think it's really challenging to try certainly on a global basis, maybe even on a regional basis, to try and come up with regulation that sort of tells people what is and what isn't legitimate, illegitimate content, right? And so those discussions are tough societal questions that need to be resolved in a way that leverages democratic processes. You have a couple of countries in Europe that passed regulation in the last 2 years. When you look at my home country, Germany, as well as France, that were mainly focused on hate speech and imposing additional regulation on what tech companies should be doing there. And again, in my view, that should absolutely be the prerogative of national governments to decide on the basis of societal consensus what the rules and the boundaries should be in that space. That same debate probably wouldn't ever go as far in the United States in terms of trying to impose those types of restrictions, although even there we see attitudes are beginning to shift a little bit. What I will say though is there are specific things that regulators in this space can do with, I think, the assistance or by being informed both by folks in tech companies as well as the incredible research that happens if it's through your group or many other similar efforts. One example would be, for example, around the transparency of political advertising, right? I think it came up earlier a little bit. There are some nascent efforts in some countries, Canada, US, France, a few others, that are trying to essentially say, we have fairly stringent rules for traditional media when it comes to political advertising to very clearly delineate who paid for it and where the author is from in terms of geography. There really isn't a good reason why we couldn't try and extend, at least in principle, those similar rules to the online space, and yet we're quite far from that at this point. And so focusing on the provenance, I think, of the speaker, and on top of that, the authenticity of the message in political advertising is a specific project, I think, that from a regulatory perspective can actually be tackled and could potentially have some impact. And so I think in part it's about trying to segment the problem in ways that we can start making some meaningful progress. And then it is, as we also said earlier, about trying to come together as companies, as governments, democratic governments, I would qualify that as we said earlier, and civil society, and trying to find these type of solutions. Thanks.
Thanks, Jan. That was a great way to tie it up. So thank you very much. Could you please put your hands together and help me thank our wonderful panelists?